Chedam Samutpadam Papanchapashmam Shivam Deshamasam Vande Vadatam. Good morning, everyone. Namo Buddhaya. So, in the last session, we had completed our discussion on how the law of cause and effect, law of karma operates. So, the core of that discussion was to look at the different kinds of classifications of karma. And through those various classifications, we tried to develop an understanding of how karma operates and what are the different kinds of karma. And then towards the end of that discussion, we also saw how to ensure that we engage in the right kind of karmic conduct so that not only do we have fortunate rebirths, but also are blessed with conducive enabling conditions in those rebirths. So that was all part of what the Lamrim text says is the training that is unique to the lower scope trainees. So we saw the lower scope trainee is inspired, or he or she aspires for rebirth in one of the higher realms as a spiritual objective, spiritual purpose, a spiritual goal, and he or she works on developing an urge for higher rebirth. And how that is ensured is by reflecting, contemplating on the nature of suffering that one experiences in the lower realms, and having developed a good understanding of the suffering that one would experience in the lower realms, then one develops an urge to be free from that kind of suffering. And what is the way out of it? The first step is to kind of develop some sort of faith in the three jewels of refuge, and also to develop a very good understanding of the law of cause and effect. So that's what we'd seen in the last session. So we take the discussion forward, and in today's discussion, we start exploring the meditations or the training that is specific or unique to the trainees who are practicing the middle scope path. So those who urge for liberation from samsara. And the first step to ensure that you develop or intensify your urge for liberation from samsara is to develop what is called renunciation. And in order for you to develop renunciation, one needs to have an understanding of the suffering that one can experience in the higher realms too. So then combine that with the understanding that we have about the suffering in the lower realms. One then realizes that whether it's the lower realms or the higher realms, there's no place in samsara that is free from suffering. And hence, our spiritual goal should be to ensure that we are free from birth in samsara. We do not take birth in samsara. So, so that is what we're going to do today. We're going to try and understand the kind of suffering that one experiences in the upper realms, in the higher realms, in the human and the realm of gods. And combine that with the discussion that combine that with the understanding that we've developed about the suffering that one experiences in the lower realms. So we come to the conclusion that there is no place in samsara that is free from suffering. So that is the purpose of this discussion, and all this pertains to the training that is specific to the trainees who train on the middle scope paths. So we'll explore that in a little detail today. And before we do that, let's just do a short meditation to calm our minds. So ensure that you have a proper posture, uh, back erect, shoulders straight, uh, arms relaxed, palms, the right palm resting in the left palm, and the tip of the thumbs touching each other, and tongue, the head slightly tucked in, slightly raised, and the chin tucked in, and tip of the tongue resting against the upper, the roof of the jaw, roof of the mouth, just behind the upper row of teeth. And you could keep your eyes half open. If you're keeping your eyes half open, then point your gaze down the ridge of your nose in the space in front of you. And if possible, if you're not sitting on a chair, you can sit cross-legged, full lotus posture if possible. If not, a regular sukhasana too. Just ensure that your back is erect, and uh, we'll do a short mindfulness meditation as we do for all our sessions. So it's called Anapanasmriti, or mindfulness of breath. Breath is a reasonably subtle object. So if you develop your ability to focus your mind on the breath, then it really helps you enhance your concentration. Um, so even with mindfulness of breath, there are different kinds of techniques. There are a couple of techniques that we've seen in our meditations in the past sessions. So we'll stick to that. So start off by observing the sensations that you experience between the tip of your nose and the upper lip as you breathe in and breathe out. Now bring the focus of your mind to your in-breath and observe the sensations that you experience in the nostril uh, through which you breathe in. Now observe your out breath and observe the sensations that you experience in the nostril that you breathe out through. Let's just do some counting meditation. So as you breathe in, just count 1, 1. And as you breathe out, count 2, 2. And then alternate, count till 10, and then start the process again. Okay, now with your mind sufficiently concentrated, let's now just do a motivation setting for the session. So just remind yourself that you've been blessed um, with a perfect human body, perfect human rebirth in this lifetime. Uh, Not only that, you have access to the doctrine. You have this wonderful opportunity to practice the dharma that was taught by the Buddha. Uh, but also remember that these enabling conditions could be taken away from you any moment. Death is uncertain. The timing of death is uncertain. One could die any moment. Could even be today. Uh, so if we uh, die and we're not fortunate, then we'll have to uh, be reborn in one of the lower realms and have to endure a lot of suffering in the lower realms. Um, so we should ask ourselves whether we are willing to bear all that suffering in the lower realms. If by some fortune we get a human rebirth in our next lifetime, or reborn as a deva, even in these realms, as we will see today, there's a lot of suffering. The human realm is characterized by a lot of suffering. It starts with our birth, and then we have suffering of sickness, and then we also experience the suffering of aging and the suffering of dying, in addition to all the mental anguish, frustration, anxiety, and all other mental problems that we experience during the course of our lives. So, whether we are born in the lower realms or we are born in the higher realms, they're not free of suffering. There's nothing to trust about rebirth in samsara. So, now that we have this human rebirth, and we've also been blessed with an intelligence that helps us understand the shortcomings of samsara and the benefits of liberation from samsara, we should all aspire for liberation as a spiritual goal. But mere individual liberation is not a sufficient spiritual goal, because that would imply that we would leave all the other sentient beings uh, in in samsara, and they would continue to suffer in samsara. So we should aim for uh, a state which would provide us with the capacity to help all sentient beings on the path of liberation. Just like we seek liberation, we should wish for liberation of all sentient beings and help them on the path towards liberation. So, in order to develop that capacity, we need to attain the state of a completely enlightened Buddha, since only a completely enlightened Buddha has that capacity. So, therefore, uh, we should aspire for the goal of complete enlightenment or sambodhi. And in order to practice that path, we need some assistance and guidance, and that comes from the three jewels. The three jewels being the Buddha, the teacher of the doctrine, the person who shows the path itself, which is the doctrine in the form of scriptures and the realizations in the minds of disciples who've been practicing the path. And then so that is the jewel of the dharma. And then the third jewel, the jewel of sangha, comprising of disciples who practice the path and have validated aspects of the path, and hence are in a position to help you from their own experience. So these are the three jewels that we should seek refuge in. These are the three jewels that will help us, assist us, guide us on the path towards liberation and omniscience. So let's take refuge in these three jewels through the short refuge prayer. Namo Buddhaya, Namo Dharmaya, Namo Sanghaya, Namo Gurubhya, Namo Buddhaya, Namo Dharmaya, Namo Sanghaya, Namo Gurubhya, Namo Buddhaya, Namo Dharmaya, Namo Sanghaya, Namo Gurubhya, Namo Buddhaya, Namo Dharmaya, Namo Sanghaya. And let's also make extensive offerings to the three jewels. Just visualize and make mental offerings to the three jewels, and follow it up with confessing all your transgressions and infractions, and rejoice in all the merit that we've accumulated and others have accumulated by engaging in virtuous activities, and also plead with our refuge to abide, postpone their nirvana, and abide with us in samsara till samsara ends, and then continue to guide us by turning the wheel of dharma. And with that prayer, let's also strengthen our resolve to pursue the path of liberation and omniscience by reciting this Bodhicitta prayer. So I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly by my practice of giving and other 5 perfections. May I become a completely enlightened Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So generate your mind in the aspect of this prayer, this Bodhicitta prayer, a mind that has the goal of, aspires for the goal of complete enlightenment, for the purpose of serving the sentient kind. Okay, so we'll begin our discussion. So before we proceed with the discussion, there was a question by, one second. So there was a question by Shuli Chan. Are you around, Shuli? Or
yes.
There was a question. Yeah, she's
Yes.
yeah. So Shuli had asked this question: as we continue to accumulate bad karma through this and our past lives, how is it possible to become Buddha? So yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. So although we realize the importance of practicing the path, we have faith in the three jewels, but because of our past dispositions, we often find ourselves in situations where we may engage in not entirely wholesome actions. And because of those unwholesome actions of ours, we do accumulate bad karma. And we, of course, have a vast deposit of bad karma from our past unwholesome actions. So now, if that is the case, then how can we ensure that or this bad karma is going to yield some fruit and some results, some karmic ripening. And because of all this accumulated bad karma from the past, if we have to sit through the karmic ripening of all this bad karma, then where would the possibly we would not have the opportunity to progress on the spiritual path and become a completely enlightened Buddha. So it's true that we have a vast deposit of bad karma from the past, and even in our present lifetimes, we do engage in unwholesome deeds and actions that lead to bad karma accumulating accumulating and then leaving a imprint or a seed on our mind streams. So that's what karma. You engage in a karmic action, and then that karmic action leaves an imprint or a seed on your mind stream. And we have these kind of seeds on our mind stream from past actions, from past lifetimes. But just like a seed needs other supporting cooperating conditions for it to fructify and yield a fruit, similarly, you have these seeds, but you can render those seeds impotent. You can ensure that they lose their potency by engaging in acts of purification. So the seed is still there, but it still has to meet with supporting conditions to fructify. So let's say you have a rice seed in your room. Just because you have that rice seed doesn't mean that it will yield a rice sapling. It will mature into a rice sapling. You'll have to nourish it with other supporting conditions like soil, moisture, and other conditions, and then it will kind of mature into uh, a sapling. But through acts of purification, one can ensure that the seed remains there, but it loses its ability to fructify into a karmic result. So that's the reason we emphasize so much the practice of purification, and there are different kinds of practices of purification. We've seen some of those practices, so we can engage in those practice of purification. And then also as we progress on the path, so as you enter the path, you enter the Mahayana path, you enter it when you develop the bodhicitta, a spontaneous bodhicitta aspiration. So you progress through the path of accumulation, and then you go to path of preparation, and then you go to path of seeing. So at a particular level in the path of preparation, once you've advanced to that level, because your realizations have now reached a reasonably high level, you kind of attain a state where you won't be propelled into a lower rebirth at some stage in the second path, in the path of preparation. And then as you advance your practice further, when you reach the path of seeing and you have a direct perception, direct realization of emptiness, then you reach a state where you won't be propelled through the force of karma in any kind of realm. So your rebirth would be through the power of prayers. So karma would lose its ability to propel a rebirth if you have a direct realization of such emptiness or suchness. So just because you have bad karma in your mind stream through your past unwholesome action doesn't mean that it prevents you from advancing towards your goal of becoming completely enlightened Buddha. So you can engage in the path of you can engage in the practices of purification to render those seeds from unwholesome actions, render them incapable of fructifying into a fruit, karmic fruit. And as you progress and as you have realization, specifically realization of emptiness, then you take away the possibility of being reborn in the lower realms, and your progress then becomes irreversible. So when you attain the slightly higher levels, from those stages, you progress, keep going forward. You do not fall back into the lower realms. So that's how you would deal with the seeds from your past uh, unwholesome actions. So, Shuli, does that answer your question, or you have any follow-up queries, or does anybody else have any follow-up query on this, or anything else from the discussion that we had in the past sessions?
Yes, great answer. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions at this? Okay. Anyways, as you have any doubts or questions, you can either voice them, or as I said, you can post them on chat and we can take them out. Okay, so let's proceed with the discussion. So for our session today, this is going to be the focus. So how to develop thoughts of yearning for liberation. So the smaller scope trainees, they aspire for higher rebirth. The middle scope trainee aspires for liberation. So the first step is to how to develop thoughts of yearning for liberation. So within that, the first step is to develop a good understanding of what kind of suffering one can experience in the upper realms. And to develop a good understanding of that, we'll have to work through these things. We'll have to figure out whether rebirth in the upper realms is a sufficient target. What are the ways to develop thoughts of yearning for liberation? And then look at the general suffering of samsara, and then the specific suffering in the upper realms, the suffering of humans, the suffering of demigods, and the suffering of gods. So let's proceed. So this is what we are looking at. So how to extract the essence from the precious human rebirth. And that has three parts to it, as we've seen: the small scope training, the middle scope training, and the great scope training. So we've completed the discussion on the small scope training, where the focus was on how to develop a yearning for good rebirth. And now we're dealing with the how to train oneself in the medium scope. The focus here is on developing thoughts about liberation, and in order to do that, we have to have a good understanding of the general suffering of samsara, and then also the specific suffering of samsara. So we've seen the 31 planes of existence. Don't need to spend time on this. So as you can see here, and the realms from level 4 to 31, inhabited by humans and gods. So within the gods also, there are three different kinds of gods. There are the gods who abide in the desire realm, those who abide in the form realm, and those who abide in the formless realm. So for rebirth in the form and the formless realm, you have to cultivate what is called samadhis, or meditative absorptions. And through the power of those absorptions, through those samadhis, you can attain rebirth in the form of the formless realms. So the four formless realms, we've seen this, I think. So the four formless realms, the first one is the realm of infinite space. Uh, so these are the names indicate the object of meditation that the person, the yogi, has taken, and then he's cultivated this absorption called the absorption in infinite space, and then the absorption in infinite consciousness, the absorption in nothingness, and in the absorption which is of neither perception nor non-perception. So these are the four formless realm planes. And then there are the 16 form realm planes. So there are 4 different kinds of absorptions that would lead to rebirth in one of these 16 form realm planes. So the first level, the second, these are called dhyanas. So the first dhyana, the second dhyana, the third dhyana, and the fourth dhyana. And within the first, second, and the third, there is a hierarchy. So there's the minor level of absorption, then the medium, and the highest. And based on those absorption states, you're reborn in one of these 16 form realm planes. And then there are the 7 desire gods also, or rather 6 desire god planes, and then 1 which we inhabit, the human beings inhabit. So you in the desire realm, you are reborn mostly through abandoning the 10 non-virtues of body, speech, and mind. So through the 10 wholesome actions, and also aided with other practices like generosity and the development of wisdom, you would be reborn in one of these 7 planes. The upper higher planes, you have to cultivate the dhyanas, the absorptions. And then there are the miserable planes, the hell beings, the animals, and the hungry ghosts. And these, you reborn in one of these planes if you do not abandon the non-virtues of body, speech, and mind, the 10 non-virtues of body, speech, and mind. So why do we say that rebirth in the upper upper realms is not sufficient? So it's mostly because in the upper realms, you're forever kind of experiencing pleasure. Or if you're born in the form or the formless realms, you're forever kind of consumed by experience of bliss, the bliss of those absorption states, the meditative absorption states that we just saw. So there's mostly no opportunity to create new merit. And then at the end of your stay in those higher realms, you inevitably fall back in the lower realms when you run out of the karma that keeps you in the higher realms. Then you fall back in the lower realms, and you have to experience a lot of suffering in the lower realms. Just because you're reborn in the upper realms does not mean that you'd be free from suffering. And because your objective is to be free from suffering, to make that state, the freedom from suffering, irreversible, it's not sufficient for us to just aspire for a rebirth in the upper realms, because inevitably later on, once your karma is exhausted, karma which keeps you in the upper realms, you'll fall back in the lower realms. So that's the reason one should not just aspire for rebirth in the upper realms. And Shantideva also in his Bodhicharya Avatar says that if you want to stop the flow of suffering for good, put a permanent end to the flow of suffering, then you must be freed from samsara for good. So, and then you have to create the causes for this freedom. It's not sufficient to just develop this aspiration, but developing the aspiration is the first step. So after having developed the aspiration to be freed from samsara for good, then you create the causes for freedom from this samsara. So what are the ways to then develop this aspiration for liberation? What are the different ways to develop the thoughts of yearning for liberation? So there are essentially 2 ways: thinking about the Four Noble Truths, and then thinking about the 12 links of dependent origination. So these are subjects that we'll explore in much more detail in the future, specifically the 12 links of dependent origination, which presents the causal sequence which keeps you trapped and bound in samsara. So starting with ignorance, then it goes on to the 12th link. The first link is ignorance, and then the 12th link is the link of aging and dying. So how exactly this causal link, causal sequence operates, we'll look at that causal sequence in much more detail in one of the subsequent future sessions. Also, the Four Noble Truths will explore in detail in the future. So here, okay, so the 12 links of dependent origination. So most of you must have heard of the 12 links, and most of you must be familiar with the regular presentation of the 12 links of dependent origination, which is called the mundane order of the 12 links of dependent origination. So it presents the mundane causal order, starting with ignorance, which leads to compositional factors of karma, which plants a seed on consciousness, on the stream of consciousness. This then yields some sort of a name and form in the form of a rebirth. The name and form then further develops, and you have the 6 doors of the essential doors. And through these 6 spheres, sense spheres, you come in contact with external objects. Contact leads to feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Hello. Okay, so contact leads to feeling, and then feeling leads to craving. So you crave for more pleasant experiences, and you crave for freedom from unpleasant experiences, sensations. And that craving that intensifies to become grasping. So you want to own the sources of this pleasure, and you want to be separated from the sources of the unpleasant sensations. And hence that craving and grasping then takes leads to the 10th link of becoming. The link of becoming indicates that the seed that you planted is mature enough to propel a new rebirth. And then rebirth happens, and rebirth then leads to the link of aging and dying. So usually there's the 12th link is the link of aging and dying, lamentation, grief, and despair, and all that. But there's this unique presentation in a sutra called the Upanishad Sutra, and it's replaced the 12 link with the link of suffering. So instead of saying aging and dying, it's given a more generic name to that link of suffering. And while we are trying to understand the suffering of the upper planes, the whole purpose of focusing so much on understanding suffering is because suffering then acts as the supporting condition to develop faith, which is the starting point of a different causal sequence. And this causal sequence is what is called the transcendental order, which indicates the liberation path, the liberative path. So it starts off with faith, and then goes on through joy, rapture, tranquility, happiness, concentration. So these all help you develop intense meditative concentrations. And with the aid of that meditative concentration, you develop through analytical meditations, you develop the knowledge of suchness. And through the knowledge of suchness, then you develop what is called disenchantment and dispassion, which is essentially an aspect of renunciation. So you develop the mind of renunciation. And because of this mind of renunciation, then you practice the path with sincerity, and you persevere on the path, and that leads to emancipation and knowledge, which leads to all the afflictions and the contaminations being removed from your mind stream. So this is the transcendental order. But the point that the slide is making is that suffering, understanding of suffering, reflection on suffering, contemplation of suffering is critical. because that kind of is the starting point. That is the supporting condition to develop faith. And what does faith do? Faith helps you awaken some sort of a spiritual awareness and the desire for enlightenment. So this desire for enlightenment is difficult to be produced in our normal course of life, in naturally in consonance with the regular modes of engagement with the world. So in our normal course of life, it's very difficult to develop this desire for enlightenment. So it's only through the experience and reflection on suffering that we develop faith, and then faith becomes the cause for us to awaken the spiritual awareness and the desire for enlightenment. So awakening to this spiritual growth, it does require us to redirect ourselves, our exertions away from our instinctual, habitual urges for pleasure and enjoyment. So we need to kind of park those urges, maybe even experience some sort of pain and suffering, temporary pain and suffering. And because of that suffering experience, then and if we reflect on the nature of that suffering, the entity of that suffering, then that helps us awaken the spiritual awareness and the desire for enlightenment. So this is an important kind of point that this sutra is making, that suffering is kind of a very essential condition, and it acts as a supporting condition for the development of faith, which then triggers this entire causal sequence, which leads to emancipation, liberation from samsara. So that's the reason we are studying suffering, and we spend so much time on understanding suffering of the lower realms. And now today we are also going to spend some time on understanding the suffering of the upper realms. So when even the Four Noble Truths, the presentation of the Four Noble Truths starts off by presenting the truth of suffering first. So the Four Noble Truths are presented in two pairs of cause and effect. So the first pair is the pair of truth of suffering and the truth of the sources of suffering. So the effect is presented first, truth of suffering, and then the cause, the sources of that suffering. So that's the first pair, cause and effect. And then the second pair, the truth of cessation and the truth or the path that leads to that cessation from suffering. So that's the result is, the effect is the truth of cessation of suffering, and the cause, in order for us to actualize that, is the truth of the path. So that's the cause. So here also you notice that the Buddha starts off by presenting, this is the first sermon that the Buddha gave, the Dharma Chakra Pravartan Sutra, in which he spoke about the Four Noble Truths. And the first thing he spoke about was the truth of suffering. So you see the point that was made in the previous slide, having a comprehensive understanding of the nature of suffering, its ubiquity, its pervasiveness. It's on the basis of that kind of reflection and that kind of contemplation that you awaken your spiritual awareness, and then that helps you with advancing on the spiritual path further. So the Four Noble Truths, these are the 16 different aspects of the Four Noble Truths. We don't need to spend too much time here. Maybe in the future we'll examine this. So why is the truth of suffering discussed first? It was taught first because we need to be moved by this ubiquity of suffering, by this understanding of the ubiquitous nature of suffering. And only on the basis of that understanding, the ubiquitous nature of suffering, would we then generate what is called renunciation, and the attitude of renunciation. So renunciation of what? Renunciation of samsara. If you're not moved, then we'll not want to abandon the causes that lead to suffering. So that's the reason why we need to have a very good comprehensive understanding of suffering. So now, in order to help us cultivate that understanding of suffering, we need to have an understanding of the general nature of suffering in samsara. So to understand that, we'll discuss these three different kinds of classifications of suffering. So the first one is the threefold classification. Then there's a sixfold classification of suffering, and then there's the eightfold classification of suffering. So we'll just see in a moment what these different kinds of classifications are. So the first one, the threefold classification of suffering, again, maybe so most of you must be familiar with this. So three different kinds of suffering. There's the suffering of suffering, suffering of change, and then there's what we call the all-pervasive formative suffering or conditioned suffering. So what do these kinds of three types of sufferings imply? So the first one, the suffering of suffering, is what we experience in the form of physical pain, physical illnesses, headaches, also the pain that we experience in birth, through different kinds of illnesses, and aging and dying, and also all the mental discomfort that comes along with these kind of physical this kind of physical suffering. So that is the suffering of suffering, the evident form of suffering that we see and experience. The second category of suffering is the suffering of change. Now, what do we mean by suffering of change? Anyone, would you like to share your thoughts on what the suffering of change means? Anyone? You must have seen. Yeah. Go ahead.
Getting old.
Getting old. Yeah, getting old. Yeah. Aging is a form of the first type of suffering. So it's suffering of suffering. Suffering of change would be youth. To take your example, suffering of change would be youth. So youth, I mean, it appears to us as not suffering. I mean, it's happiness. We associate happiness with youth, all the different aspects and characteristics of youth that we have. But youth is essentially the first step in experiencing the suffering of suffering, the suffering of aging. So because youth is characterized by this nature of transitoriness or impermanence, we are not going to be youthful forever. So while we experience some pleasure in the state of youth at the moment, that all that is going to wither away because of its transitory, impermanent nature, and that youth is going to transform into old age. Old age we associate with suffering. Youth we associate with pleasure and happiness. But youth is also suffering, suffering of change. So suffering of change essentially is the first step that is a state that would eventually evolve into the suffering of suffering. So to take another example, while we sit in meditation and we are sitting cross-legged, we develop some pain in our knees and we want to relieve that pain, suffering. So we get up and we stand, and then we experience some relief and maybe even a little bit of pleasure when we get up. But then if that was a permanent kind of experience of happiness, pleasure, if that had the capacity to give you permanent pleasure or happiness, then no matter how long you stand, it should continue yielding pleasure or happiness and relief. But after 15-20 minutes of standing, you again develop discomfort and you want to sit again. So the moment you got up from your meditation posture, you experience relief. So you kind of experience relief and pleasure. So that is suffering of change, because ultimately it's going to evolve or change into the suffering of suffering. Because ultimately, after 20 minutes, it's going to change into some sort of physical discomfort, making you change that, making you want to change the state of standing into something else that will that you think will yield pleasure or relief or happiness. So that's the second form of suffering, the suffering of change. And then there's the third most important uh, kind of suffering, classification of suffering, the all-pervasive condition suffering. So here, what we are referring to is an essential characteristic of our existence, uh, because we are forever under the influence, power of two factors: the factor of karma and the factor of afflictions which lead to karma. Afflictions like attachment or hatred uh, drive your actions. So if your action is driven through hatred and you engage in an unwholesome action of violence, and let's say you harm somebody else, or take it further, you kill somebody else, then you accumulate the negative karma of having taken somebody's life. And that uh, plants a seed on your stream of consciousness. And then that propels a rebirth in the lower realms. Uh, Contrary to this, if you engage in a virtuous action of, let's say, abandonment of the 10 non-virtues, you create merit that propels a rebirth in one of the upper realms. But no matter, as long as you're under the influence of the afflictions and you create karma through motivated actions, you will be born in one of the planes in samsara, the 31 different planes. And since you have not made any effort to exit that cycle, you will be forever kind of bound in samsara. So this is what this third type of suffering is implying. Because you're forever under the influence, your existence is conditioned by the two factors of karma and afflictions. Uh, what you do, you carry with you the potential for future suffering at all times. So suffering is just around the corner. And because you're subject to these conditions of karma and afflictions, now these two factors, karma and afflictions, lead to uh, this karma that propels a new rebirth, and then karma that it means that you're deprived of resources in the future. So completion karma and the impelling karma, both those are created, and you're kind of forever bound by those. And the impelling karma generates a new form. So you have a new physical form, and that physical form then becomes the basis for you to experience the first two types of suffering. So the suffering of change and the suffering of suffering. So karma and afflictions are creating the conditions where you know you have these aggregates which become the basis for you to experience the suffering of suffering and the suffering of change. That is the reason this classification, this third type of suffering is the most important. It's kind of driving, it's kind of the root of the first two kinds of suffering. So this is the threefold classification of suffering. And then there's the eightfold classification of suffering. So the eightfold classification of suffering, there's if you're reborn as humans, then there's the suffering of birth. So uh, most of us, rather in general, there's this tendency to romanticize the process of birth when a child is born. But the scriptures kind of indicate otherwise. They say that the process of birth is extremely painful for the newborn. So there's a lot of suffering that one experiences in the process of being born. So there's a lot of suffering of birth, then there's suffering of old age that we all know of, then suffering of illness, of course, again, we know of, and a lot of suffering in death too. And so those are the four sufferings, the suffering of birth, old age, illness, and death that are mentioned in the 12 links of dependent origination. And then there's the fifth one, the suffering of encountering what is unpleasant. So you encounter things that you deem to be unpleasant, and then you are also you experience a lot of suffering when you're separated from what is pleasant, and you experience suffering of not getting what one wants. So you aspire for things, and you're frustrated in your effort to uh, possess those things, make them in your own. So you do not find what you seek. And then there's the eighth one, the suffering of the five appropriated aggregates, which is essentially the third kind of suffering that we just spoke of. The five appropriated aggregates form the physical aggregate, and the mental aggregate form feeling, consciousness, compositional factors. So those five appropriated aggregates, they become the basis for you to uh, experience the other seven kinds of suffering. So this is the eightfold classification of suffering. And then there is the sixfold classification of suffering. So we suffer from the bane of uncertainty, or the misfortune of uncertainty. Our existence is characterized by uncertainty. Or then there's the bane of being dissatisfied, because our existence is characterized by unsatisfactoriness because of the quality of impermanence and transitoriness. Then there is the bane of repeatedly leaving bodies, the bane of being conceived and born over and over again, the bane of moving from high to low over and over again. So there's, it's almost like you're under the force of some sort of a spiritual gravity that keeps drawing you back to the lower states, whether it's rebirth or whether it's even within a specific particular kind of rebirth, from a prosperous affluent state to a state of poverty, from a state of youthfulness and healthy being to a state of being old and deprived of health. So that's the fifth one, the bane of moving from high to low over and over again, and the bane of having no companion. So these are the six different kinds of suffering according to the sixfold classification. So we'll examine each of these in detail. We've run out of time today, so we'll follow it up in our next session. We'll examine each of these six different kinds of sufferings that have been mentioned here. And then we'll also look at the specific suffering that is characteristic of uh, the human realm, then the realm of gods, the demigods and the gods. So we'll look at that in the next session. So we'll pause here for our session today, and we'll just end the session with a short dedication. Okay, let's just compose ourselves again. Just make sure that you're comfortable in your posture, and just close your eyes and reflect on the discussion that we've had so far today. So we've initiated our discussion on the middle scope training, and within that we need to first of all figure out why it is not sufficient to aspire for um, rebirth in the upper realms. That was the first thing that we dealt with. And then we saw what are the two ways to generate this urge for liberation. So within that, we saw that we need to develop an understanding of the Four Noble Truths, specifically the first one, the truth of suffering, and also through the 12 links of dependent origination, which again speaks of the 12 links which indicate the causal sequence that leads to suffering in samsara. And then we saw what are the general suffering that we experience in samsara. And within that, we saw the different kinds of classifications of samsara, the threefold classification of suffering, the sixfold classification of suffering, and the eightfold classification of suffering. So recollect these threefold classifications, threefold classification, the sixfold classification, and the eightfold classification. Just recollect for a moment. And we've spared some time and some of our resources to participate in this discussion. So we've accumulated some merit through this virtuous activity. So let's direct that merit. So due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all sentient beings without exception into that enlightened state. Or may the supreme jewel bodhicitta that does not arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. So with that dedication, we'll pause here. Thank you very much for your time and patience. Enjoy your